Hello, good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Prime Minister came to power promising to be Mr Competence, fixing the mistakes of the Liz Truss era. But if you promise competence, you've got to be in control. And now Rishi Sunak is under pressure to show he has got a grip on our borders, on inflation and on striking workers planning a wave of walkouts this winter. And this week's Chester by-election, with Labour's best ever result in the city, was a reminder of what is at stake politically. So lots to discuss on today's show with our guests. We'll be joined on the programme by the Conservative chairman, Nadhim Zahawi. From Labour, we'll speak to the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. Germany's ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger, will be here in the studio with us. Plus, we'll talk China with a former Conservative Party leader, Sir Iain Duncan Smith. And the culture in the police with a former Assistant Commissioner at the Met, Helen King. Now, it was the worst results for the Conservatives in Chester for nearly 200 years. If it was replicated at a general election, Keir Starmer would be in power with a comfortable majority. No wonder, perhaps, that so many Conservative MPs have seen the writings on the wall and have decided to stand down before the next election. Well, the man tasked with pulling the campaign together is the Conservative Party chairman, Nadhim Zahawi, whose job it is to lead from the front, and we can hear from him now. Thank you so much for being on the programme this morning. If I may, I just want to start away from politics, because 6 children under the age of 10 have died after developing the infection strep A. And I know this is something that so many families are going to be really concerned about. How worried should we be about it?
Yes, and I think it's important to highlight that the UK Health Security Agency have said that in most cases it will be mild cases of strep A, but it is highly infectious, which is why I think the important message to get across this morning is parents should look out for the symptoms. So fever, headache, skin rash, that sort of feeling of the skin being slightly rough. Really important to be vigilant because in the very rare circumstance that it becomes serious, then you need urgent treatment, obviously.
Yes, certainly. Thank you for giving the symptoms. I know it's something that definitely lots of parents in particular will be keen to get the full information on. Now, you're announcing today what you describe as sensible contingency measures in the event of public sector strikes. So what's the plan?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the first plan is to get these strikes called off. I think the important thing to remember is Putin is using energy as a weapon because he's failing so badly in this illegal war in Ukraine. That energy use by Putin means we've had very high inflation rates and we've got to try and bring down inflation. If you chase inflation or above inflation, in some cases, pay, then you will embed inflation for longer and hurt the most vulnerable, in fact, which is our message to the unions, is to say, this is not a time to strike, this is time to try and negotiate. But in the absence of that, it's important for the government, it's the right and responsible thing to do, to have contingency plans in place. And we have a very strong team at Cobra, and when I was in the seat of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, we were doing a lot of the work in looking at what we need to do to minimise the disruption to people's lives. Whether it's unfair if you're travelling at Christmas for the border force or any other workforce to really disrupt people's lives or livelihoods.
Let's look at the specifics. Are you talking about the military being involved? Soldiers could be driving ambulances.
So we're looking at the military, we're looking at a specialist response force, which we've actually set up a number of years ago, a surge capacity to be able to deal with, in the unfortunate circumstance, if you do have, say, a strike at border force, you've got to be able to make sure that there is minimum disruption. The most important thing is to secure...
Could be coming in, filling some of these roles of
correct.
striking
So that
workers.
we have to make sure our borders are always secure, and that is something that we guarantee.
And is it the same in the NHS?
And
as
again,
well?
of course, in things like driving ambulances, other parts of the public sector, we've got to try and minimise disruption. But the way you try and deal with this is if the unions can see that, look, you're chasing inflation or above inflation pay deals is not the thing to do right now. This is the time to come together and to send a very clear message to Mr. Putin that we're not going to be divided in this way.
Just to look at the specifics as well. Are you also looking at using pharmacists to ease pressure on the NHS, as the Sunday Telegraph is reporting? So perhaps pharmacists being able to diagnose minor conditions and even prescribe antibiotics?
So the hope is obviously that the NHS, and if there is a strike, and again, I hope there isn't a strike, say, for example, with the nurses, is that there is a minimum safety level of delivery in place already, but the NHS will look at all contingency planning to make sure that patients are able to get the urgent treatment that they need.
So you could be looking at pharmacists playing a bigger role there.
Well, the NHS will make sure that we have to be able to deliver a safe level of treatment and support to patients at all times. And I hope, again, I would put it back to the unions themselves to say, one, we shouldn't be striking. If you look at what the pay review bodies for the NHS recommended, we've accepted that recommendation. In fact, last year, when pay was frozen, nurses got a 3% pay rise. They do an incredible job. Of course, I understand that. But to ask for 19% pay rise, which cost the NHS £10 billion, I think it's the wrong thing to do right now.
I do want to come back on this as well, because, you're talking about not chasing inflation. For lots of people who are on low-pay jobs, they're not chasing inflation. They're trying to get a pay that is matching the cost of living, because they're looking at their shopping bills going up, they're looking at their energy bills going up. They want a pay to be reflecting how much more they're having to spend on things. It's not about embedding inflation for them, it's about surviving.
Of course, and absolutely, which is why the Chancellor came to the dispatch box and delivered a £150 billion energy package. By the way, if you take that into equivalence, that's the equivalent of the whole of the NHS to support people's households. Otherwise, their energy bills would have spiked. To support businesses as well, the money we're putting into helping those most vulnerable, the 8 million most vulnerable households, is significant. We have to come together. This is not a time to be divided, to, I hope, send a very clear message to Mr. Putin that he can't use energy as a weapon in this way, and we will remain united, which is why we've accepted the pay review bodies on the NHS and on schools.
A nurse on 20 grand a year, you would think that maybe there were other ways of sending Putin a clear message on Ukraine, rather than the fact that you're going to have to have a real-term pay cut.
No, but we've accepted the pay review body on nurses, and as I said to you, last year they got 3%. This year's recommendation is £1,400, so the starting salary of a nurse would be £31,000. It is difficult. I'm absolutely conscious of the fact of how hard things are at the moment, but this is not a time to go for 19% pay rise that will cost £10 billion, because if you accept all the inflation level pay rises, that's about £28 billion. It costs every household just short of £1,000. That is unsustainable when we're trying to be fiscally disciplined and bring inflation under control. Because if inflation is embedded, it'll hurt those families, those nurses, even more in the long term.
Now, I want to talk about immigration, because we've seen record levels of immigration, record numbers of small boats crossing the Channel as well. Many people voted for Brexit to be able to control Britain's borders. Are we in control of them?
So on illegal migration, small boats and these gangs that are preying on the vulnerabilities, putting lives at risk, we have a plan. The Prime Minister, within weeks...
Are we in control of our borders?
Well, of course we are in control of our borders, but there is an issue around these small boats and these gangs and illegal migration. And the Prime Minister, within weeks of taking power, signed an agreement with France to increase the number of patrols by, I think, about 40%, which will help on this. They've already turned back about 30,000 people who would have come across. The numbers are still far too high. I recognise that. And again, I spent some time in the Cabinet Office looking at this. We are determined to deal with it. This Prime Minister is determined to deal with it. There are no easy solutions, but there are a number of things that we can do, including operationalising Rwanda to actually send a very clear message to these gangs that this will not work. And I think the moment that happens, you'll see the numbers begin to drop rapidly. As we saw when if you remember, under Theresa May, we dealt with the issue of people coming across, being smuggled in trucks.
Talking about...
And reduced that and took it to near zero. So it's important to focus on it. And then on legal migration, we need to make sure that we focus on if there is any abuse of the legal migration system, if there are people, for example, our universities do a brilliant job and it's a great export for the UK. People are coming here doing their PhDs and their masters and creating new innovative things for the British economy. But if there's an abuse of the system, then we should stamp that out as well.
So you are looking then at reducing the number of foreign students coming to university?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
What I said to you is foreign students coming to our universities are a great export. These are really, really important to us and, of course, our economy,
okay.
To our really high-quality universities. But if there is abuse, and there was in the past, I remember some time back, bogus universities setting up kebab shops.
On illegal migration, because there is another question I was keen to squeeze in on this. There's a report by Nick Timothy, who, of course, was the Chief of Staff to Theresa May, who recommends banning people who enter the UK through illegal routes from ever settling in the United Kingdom.
There should not be a need for people to come through on an illegal route, because if you have a legitimate right to settlement, to refuge, then you should be able to settle here. And it's right that we should address the issue of illegal migration.
So you are potentially considering banning people who enter the UK illegally from ever settling?
Well, look, that's an issue. That's a question for the Home Secretary.
Okay.
What I'm saying to you is we've got to deal with the gangs that are exploiting people, putting their lives at risk on these small boats. And I am absolutely certain that the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary are focused on this. No easy answers, but we will absolutely deliver against this in the weeks and months to come.
Now, I want to talk to you with your party chair hat on, if I may. You're responsible for campaigning, you've got a big role in election planning as well. So I just want to look at the state of the Conservative Party right now. This is the current tracker poll from YouGov. You can see there has been a slight narrowing, I guess, of the polls, but it's been nothing like a big bounce for Rishi Sunak. Labour's still well ahead. And, of course, if these polls were replicated in an election, it would be Keir Starmer in Downing Street. How concerned are you?
So when you ask people, and I know a little bit about polling, because I founded YouGov.
Well, here you go. Is it a bit awkward looking at YouGov, your company, having the
not at all. There's lots of quality
polls.
pollsters, including YouGov. But if you actually look beneath the headline, a couple of things I would pull out from that. One, when you ask people the question, if there is an election tomorrow, how would you vote? Well, people know there's no election tomorrow. So that response, what you're seeing there, is currently how they feel about the government's track record on delivery. Now, we know we've had a difficult time. You know we've had a difficult time. I've been on this show and other shows having to explain why we're going through this sort of difficult period in the parliamentary party and in our leadership. We're in rebuilding mode now to make sure that we be ready and fit for purpose for the local elections next year and then for a general election in 2024. Now, if you dig beneath the data, I'd be worried if I was Keir Starmer, because actually...
You'd be worried if you were Keir Starmer?
I would.
Look at that red line all the way, look at that space between the two lines.
I'm going to tell you for why, if you'll allow me, right? If you look at his numbers, it's very soft. There's not a great passion for what Keir Starmer is saying. Certainly there's no passion for him when he went before the Trade Union Congress saying he'll repeal all of the trade union legislation that the Conservatives have brought in. He's made that promise. And if you ask that same people, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think most of them will say it's a bad thing. But we are in a rebuilding exercise. We've got to rebuild that trust with the public. So that began with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Autumn Statement to deal with inflation. When we bring inflation back under control, the Bank of England, that's independent, will do that. They have all the tools available to them. But we have a responsibility to help them because we have fiscal responsibility to do that. When we've done that, when we've delivered on innovation, that 20 billion investment, when we've delivered on skills, when we've delivered on the infrastructure that people want to see in their constituencies and small boats, it's a real problem for us, right? Then you'll see those numbers move in the right direction. I'm confident of that.
And if you can't deliver on things like small boats?
We will. That's my point.
Now, you talk about rebuilding. Is it true that CCHQ is now ranking Conservative MPs on how many leaflets they deliver and how many doors they knock on? According to The Times, they use Theresa May as an example, pointing out that she's out twice a week. Is that right?
I like all candidates, all MPs, as they do themselves, by the way, to be out on the doorstep, knocking on doors.
So it sounds like you are ranking them.
Engaging with their constituents. It's the right thing to do.
Who's the best performer?
Well, there are lots of great performers, and you will see, by the way, the phones are ringing at CCHQ, people have come back, people are supporting us. The atmosphere in the building, I think, is incredibly positive. And as I said to you, we'll continue to build. We've got local elections, great councillors, great candidates for local elections next May, and then, of course, for the election, whenever the Prime Minister calls it.
It's interesting, because you're talking there about the positive atmosphere in CCHQ, and I have to say, if you take a step back and look at the country right now, the Conservatives, of course, have been in power for 12 years. We've got record A&E waiting times. We're spending more on debt interest payments than education. Whether it's the time you're waiting to book a driving test or the backlogs in the court, it feels like this is a country that is breaking at the seams. Why would anyone vote for the Conservatives who've been in power presiding over this?
Well, because I was close to this. We delivered the most successful vaccination programme in this country's history, probably in the world, where we've protected the nation. And you see what's happening in countries today. Look at what's happening in China vis-à-vis dealing with the pandemic today. We've dealt with that pandemic. During that period, Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, had to put over £400 billion to work to protect people's livelihoods and, of course, jobs. We've done it again just now because Putin's using energy as a weapon. £150 billion energy package. 3 million businesses protected that would have gone to the wall. Perfectly viable businesses.
But we know as well that the
households
the
that would have struggled. £150 billion of additional help for people. If you take all of that, that has to be paid for, right? Then, of course, we have the recovery. The NHS has to recover from the pandemic. That is happening now. We've dealt with a 2-year waiting list. By next April, we'll deal with the 18-month waiting list. And, of course, we've got a package for Christmas at the moment to make sure the NHS gets through Christmas, a £500 million package to get people into social care, a big investment in social care. All these things are happening. But the onus is on us to demonstrate to the public, to show by doing.
Particularly
and that is what we're doing.
Particularly because we just had a Conservative Prime Minister who crashed the economy, became the shortest-serving PM ever, and had to U-turn on her entire budget.
Well, I'm going to repeat what Jeremy Hunt said, the Chancellor. He said, that mini budget was reversed within 3 weeks. Even the OBR would say to you that that's not the impact on the economy. The OBR, in fact, said, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the impact on the economy is because of Putin's use of energy.
They have also said, they have also talked about the impact of the mini-budget as well. It's not purely international factors.
They said you're quite right, but they said the predominant bulk of the impact was because of Putin using energy as a weapon. We mustn't forget that. Peace has a price. And we have to continue to support Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky because this illegal war has to end with Russia leaving Ukraine.
There are reports that some Conservative MPs believe that Boris Johnson may still be the answer to your election issues, shall we say. Here's Stephen Swinford in The Times. Boris Johnson's supporters are convinced that Sunak will fall and that Johnson will replace him, with the May local elections seen as a focal point. Now, you obviously backed Boris Johnson to be leader. Do you still speak to him?
I speak to Boris Johnson. In fact, I spoke for him in his constituency. He did a conversation with the chairman of the party. Let me tell you what Boris Johnson thinks, as he did when he reflected and stepped aside and supported Rishi Sunak. He said, I will not be selfish. I will put country and party ahead. And Rishi has the overwhelming support of the parliamentary party, which is why he supported him. That was the right thing to do. We have to remain united. We've got local elections coming up next year, and we've got a whole delivery programme on health, of course, on education, and, of course, safer streets and small boats that we've got to deliver against. That is what Boris Johnson's focused on at the moment. OK. No chance, then, that he'll come back as leader? No, because having another leadership election will be a surefire way of us losing in elections. OK. One question that I just want to ask before we finish, which is about the allegations around a Conservative MP. The victims, we understand, or alleged victims, haven't made formal complaints, but a number of Conservative MPs have made complaints or reports about this person's alleged behaviour. Should they be suspended from the Conservative Party? Well, this is a very important safeguarding question, and the moment I walked into the building at Conservative headquarters, I asked for independent legal advice on this issue, as well as our own in-house legal advice on the case. We also spoke to the House authorities. We spoke to the Priority Ethics team on this. And it is up to the police, because these allegations are third-party allegations that have been handed to the police. I've spoken to the police as well, of course. And if the police decide to take action, then of course we will take action as well.
OK. Just finally, England playing later today.
Indeed.
Are you going to be watching?
Of course.
Is it coming home?
It will. I'm not going to sing that song or go anywhere near it, because every time I've done that, it has broken my heart.
OK, thank you very much indeed for being on the programme. Nadhim Zahawi there, the chair of the Conservative Party. Well, let's go and get Labour's take this morning, shall we? Because we can talk to the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, who joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us. We just heard from Nadhim Zahawi. I showed him some polling, which shows how far ahead the Labour Party is. But he says it's Keir Starmer who should be worried right now. Do you think that's right?
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, we're not complacent about things, and the only poll that matters is the poll that we see on general election day. But we've made massive progress as a party, and we're the only people setting out a clear vision for how Britain could be better. And Labour's plan would mean we deliver well-paid, highly skilled jobs in every corner of our country, and we get our economy growing once more, something we haven't seen over these last 12 years.
As you say, you are doing well in the polls, so I'm quite keen to try and find out a bit more of what you say is a clear vision of what, a Labour government would look like, what the country under Labour would look like. You say you'll deliver more jobs, fairness. I mean, these are things that no one would disagree with, but I'm keen to get a bit more of a sense about, the sort of values and the principles that a Keir Starmer government would entail. So would you spend more money on public services than the Conservatives?
Well, we don't yet know what the situation will be with the public finances. The Conservatives crashed the economy, and an incoming Labour government is likely to inherit a very difficult situation, and that will mean we have to make difficult choices around public money. But we also have choices, of course, as well, about how we raise money. That's why I believe that we should end the tax benefits that private schools enjoy and invest in a brilliant state education for every child, driving up high standards right across our schools. But, we're not in a position right now, of course, given the very uncertain nature of the economy, to set out exact figures on what that first Labour budget would look like.
OK, I will talk to you about the education stuff and give you the space to talk about your policy later in the interview. Not completely clear from that question whether you'd spend more on public services than the Conservatives. How about immigration? We've got record levels of immigration. Nadhim Zahawi was saying that it's too high. The Conservatives want to bring down particularly illegal migration. What's Labour's position? Would you like to see immigration higher or lower?
I think my starting point is that immigration has always been an important part of our national story as a country. I wouldn't be stood here speaking to you today were it not for the fact that my grandparents came to this country from Ireland, worked in the NHS and helped to build our country. But I do recognise at the same time that we need to make sure we're investing in the skills of people here, that we're giving everyone the opportunity to succeed. So there is a balance to strike, and that's why we would maintain a points-based system where it comes to immigration.
OK, that's clear on the points-based system, certainly. But can we talk about strikes now? Because, again, it's another issue that I think so many people will have big questions about. Public sector workers want a pay rise to match inflation. So inflation obviously currently around 11%. Nadhim Zahawi says that would be unsustainable, it would be unaffordable. What is Labour's position? Would you give inflation matching pay rises to public sector workers?
I completely recognise that right across our public services, whether that's nurses or teachers, they've been terribly let down by this government and they want a fair deal. And that is around pay, but it's also about terms and conditions. The fact that so many people working in our public services are burnt out, feel that they have a government that has completely abandoned them. Under the last Labour government, we made sure that we invested in our workforce, that we made sure they were paid properly for the amazing job that they are doing. And I think that is incredibly important. But as I say, pay is one very important element of this. But if you speak to head teachers or school support staff, as I do right across the country, they just feel, overworked, let down and really badly demoralised. And that's why it'll be the job of an incoming Labour government to demonstrate that we want to work with the people, the amazing people in our public services. to make sure that you don't have to wait months on end to get access to a hospital appointment, the fact that children in all of our schools have opportunities to succeed, and that we don't end up in this position as we are now, where staff are having to put their hand in their own pocket in order to make sure that children don't go hungry when they arrive at school. And Labour's plan around breakfast clubs, making sure that every child in our country gets a brilliant start to the day, is part of how we make life a lot better and easier for staff working in our public services too.
I just want to come back because the question was specifically about pay. You say that you would like to see a fair deal. Public sector workers should be paid properly, but you know, the difficult thing is working out what that means. Would you like to see inflation matching pay rises in the public sector?
I want to see a fair deal for all of our workers right across public services. Of course, this is all about negotiation and compromise.
Everyone would say they want to see a fair deal. The question is, what is that fair deal?
Won't negotiate. Well, I do think it means recognising the pressure that people are under right now, but also over the last 12 years, pay hasn't been keeping up with demands that workers in our vital services are facing. But you can't get to a position of agreement if you're not prepared to even have that conversation. And what I hear time and again, you know, whether it's rail or our schools or the health service, ministers are just not prepared to sit down and talk about these issues properly. We won't get an agreement and we won't get a negotiated settlement that all sides can live with if ministers just say, well, it's nothing to do with me. You know, if I was Secretary of State for Education, I'd be around the table trying to get a solution, working with trade unions to find a way through all of this, not stoking tension as ministers all too often seem intent on doing.
I don't know what, you know, we started the interview talking about the polls, and it's pretty clear how well Labour are doing with the polls. If they were replicated in a general election, like that result in Chester, then you would have a majority. So I get, you know, that there is obviously a desire in Labour right now to not scare the horses, effectively, to kind of play it safe, and then you'll hopefully get, as you say, you know, that majority at the next election. But I guess there's a bit of a frustration sometimes interviewing people from Labour when it does feel like you're being a bit reluctant to nail your colours to the mast. On public sector pay, for example, it's almost like you don't want to put off either side in the debate by saying that you want a fair deal, you want everyone to talk. But I'm not really clear on whether or not you think that inflation matching pay rises are unaffordable, or if you're saying that it's something that actually the government should do, whatever happens.
Because I think trust in politics matters, and I'm not going to make promises this morning to you that I don't feel confident I can deliver. I think that's been what's been so corrosive to our politics in recent years, is Tory politicians in particular saying one thing and doing another. So yes, absolutely, I want to see a better deal for the brilliant people that work right across our education system, and a part of that is around the choices that we make around how we find investment, and our policy around private schools, around ending those tax breaks and putting that £1.7 billion into more teachers in our classrooms, into better mental health support for all of our children, and in making sure that all of our staff are properly supported. That's one, I think, really straightforward way the government right now could be doing things differently, and that's a clear divide that you see between Labour and the Conservatives. Our focus on high standards in all of our brilliant state schools, but on driving up standards further, and Rishi Sunak, who isn't prepared to stand up to the vested interests in his own party and isn't prepared to do what's right by children and families in our country.
You're also calling for a regulatory investigation into private schools. Just to explain what that's about.
What we've seen for years now are fees going up, often very substantially, and you know, I think there needs to be a full investigation into whether that market is operating effectively. We've heard lots of outlandish claims from Jeremy Hunt and from Rishi Sunak and others about the impact of Labour's policy, which I just don't think are borne out by the evidence. But if you look at the fees that private schools are charging right now, they have gone up way beyond earnings in cash terms, and I think it is important that the CMA investigate this matter and see whether this market is working properly. And I think it does now fall to the Secretary of State for Education, to whom I've written, to make sure that matter is referred to the CMA and that they look into it. But whose side is she on? Is she on the side of parents, on the side of children, on delivering a brilliant education for all of our children? Or is she not prepared either to stand up to the vested interests in her own party?
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Bridget Phillipson there for the Labour Party. We're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. We've heard from the Conservatives and we've also heard from the Labour Party. Nadhim Zahawi telling us that the government was looking to bring in the military if strikes go ahead in the health service. Plus, still to come on the programme this morning. In just a moment, we'll talk to the former Conservative leader, Sir Iain Duncan Smith, about what to do about China. A little later, we'll hear from a former Assistant Commissioner of the Met Police, Helen King, about whether the UK's public institutions are doing enough to stamp out racism and misogyny. Plus, we'll be getting some immediate reaction from our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who's been watching all of our interviews as well, so we'll talk to Sam a bit later on as well. Now, the UK may be on its third Prime Minister this year, but one thing hasn't changed, the deadlock over post-Brexit trade agreements with Northern Ireland. However, this week, the European Union said it was encouraged by its first talks with Rishi Sunak. Joining us now is the German ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. It's been a bumpy few months for the UK, shall we say, partly because of global factors like inflation, partly because of domestic issues as well. How do you think the UK is currently perceived from abroad?
Yeah, I would say that everybody is glad to see that financial markets are now again more stable. But the challenges you have described, we are all facing them. High inflation, energy prices going up, governments struggling to get the necessary support for business and private households. So I would say there is also quite some understanding for the challenges.
Yeah, those challenges, as you say, experienced by countries across Europe, the rest of the world as well. What do you see as the way forward for that?
I think we have to be aware that this energy crisis will not go away after winter, because we will have zero Russian gas in Europe, and Russia has been by far the largest supplier. That means that not only Germany, the whole of Europe, UK, will have to get gas from the international markets. And that means for the next 1.5, 2 years, we might face a situation with high energy prices.
Let's talk a bit about Ukraine. Shall we? Because I think the German Chancellor spoke to Vladimir Putin this week on the phone. He urged him to withdraw troops and to try and find a diplomatic solution. Is Germany optimistic about a way out of the war?
We are not yet optimistic. We don't see a fundamental change in the Russian position. Putin continues this really terrorizing the civilian population, and we are very concerned about that, because these attacks on the energy infrastructure mean that many people with freezing temperatures might be forced to leave Ukraine. So we expect another wave of refugees in the coming weeks. But to your question, no, we don't see for the foreseeable future a willingness to engage in a diplomatic solution.
In the conversation, Olaf Scholz also vowed to continue German support for Ukraine. There has been some criticism, hasn't there, that Germany was a bit slow off the mark in offering support to Ukraine. Perhaps you could have done a little bit more, some would say, in terms of military support as well. I think we can show that the different amounts that countries have spent on weapons and equipment to Ukraine. It's the numbers just on the left there. You can see the US at the top, followed by the EU. But both Poland and the UK above Germany, despite having smaller populations. Should Germany do more?
Yeah. I think these figures are not correct, because we have sent many weapon systems which were written off. So, for example, the anti-aerial Gepard tanks, which were already been written off. So we can't have them in this statistic as new tanks. So I would not give too much on it. But my feeling is that we started a little bit later than others. But in the end, if you look at the amount of weapon systems, especially IRIS-T anti-aerial missiles, they are extremely effective. 100% of Russian missiles attacking Kiev, the last raid, were shot down. So I would say we are doing all quite well.
And I guess there's been action on energy as well in the EU too, where there is obviously more of a dependence on Russian oil and gas.
Yeah, but this has been dramatically reduced. But let me say on weapons, I think the key issue is that we continue to send weapons and ammunition and assure maintenance of the equipment we have sent over the coming months. Only if that happens, Russia will understand that they will not really be able to defeat Ukraine. So this is, I think, the key challenge for all of us.
Before we move on to Brexit, which I do want to do, I just want to ask you a question on China, because we've seen some really extraordinary protests in China recently, originally about the lockdown, but also spilling over to other issues as well. Chancellor Scholz announced recently that Germany is going to try and reduce its dependence on trade with China. That will be quite difficult to do, though, won't it?
It's a challenge for all of us. And I think the key issue is that we have to diversify our trade relations. So we have to look at our weaknesses. The weaknesses like, for example, semiconductors, batteries, rare earths. So we have to invest in Western production, try to reshore certain industries. But let me say that we are working in Germany on a new China strategy. And we are cooperating very closely with the British government, which is doing the update of the integrated review. So I would say we are analysing together the challenges of China.
It's interesting that the UK and Germany you see as perhaps working together to get a new sort of strategy on this then.
Yes, and we have to do that. I think if there is one lesson of Russia's war of aggression, is that we have to reduce dependencies from China.
Now, there's been lots of speculation in the UK about Rishi Sunak's approach to Brexit. Are you optimistic that there could be some kind of breakthrough in the disagreement about the Northern Ireland Protocol?
I think that we have now a different basis for negotiations. I see an openness to engage. There have already been talks. And yes, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic because in the end, there is a landing zone for the Northern Ireland Protocol's implementation. It is possible to find a solution. The difficult issue is more the political, on the reaction of the DUP, the risk of an election in Northern Ireland. So there are many political issues which go together with it. But if we speak about the negotiation process, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic.
That's interesting. Do you think then that Rishi Sunak has a different attitude, a different set of priorities perhaps to Liz Truss and perhaps also Boris Johnson?
Yeah, I would say that even Liz Truss made some steps towards Europe. She participated in Prague at the first meeting of the European Political Community. And the first talks were already under Liz Truss with James Cleverly. So I would say we see in general a different attitude. Maybe it has also to do with the war in Ukraine, that everybody understands that in the West we have more important challenges to face and that democracies should work together and should be able to sort out an issue like Northern Ireland.
With the, you talked about the threat from Ukraine and Russia, but also, obviously, we are facing an economic crisis as well, right, with energy bills. Given that, do you think that there is a desire, both from the EU side, but also from the British side, I guess, to have a closer relationship?
I would say yes, and it has always been the position of the German government that we want a relationship as close as possible with the United Kingdom. And yes, you mentioned energy. This is a perfect example. If we look at the challenges, electricity supply for the UK in winter, a lot of LNG went through the UK to Germany, to the center of Europe. So energy is a perfect example of an area where we should cooperate to mutual advantage.
There's been speculation about a so-called Swiss deal, which effectively means access to the single market, but it would come with greater contributions to the EU budget and also more immigration from Europe as well. Now, officially, the UK government has ruled it out, but I guess what I'm interested in is, would that even be a possibility? Would it even be something that would be on the table from the European side?
I would say that we welcome that there is a discussion about this kind. We don't have to go into the details of the Swiss model, but that the government or parts of the government are thinking about how to have a better and closer relationship with the European Union is something that we see very positively.
What is your take on the opposition's perspective on this? It feels that Keir Starmer is perhaps reluctant to talk too much about Brexit. He, of course, was a very strong Remainer. Would you like to see a stronger line from Labour?
I think that's really the decision that Labour has to take. But we see also very positively that Labour is willing to have a very close relationship with Europe. And I think the rest we will have to leave it now to the negotiations, because if we achieve a solution on Northern Ireland, then this will help also to develop other areas of cooperation. So I would see the solution of the Northern Ireland Protocol question as a first step, and there will be others then to follow.
There's a lot of talk about an independent Scotland here in the UK as well. If Scotland was to vote for independence, would they have to adopt the euro to join the EU?
I don't really want to get into an internal question, but let me put it like that. Every country that is joining the European Union, and we are currently negotiating with some countries in the Western Balkans, know that they have to introduce the euro.
Interesting. And then just finally, could you see a position in the future where the UK joins the single market?
Very difficult to predict. I would say let's take it step by step. But in Germany, obviously, there is a lot of interest in having, as I said, the United Kingdom as close as possible to Europe and to Germany.
Thank you. Now, I'm sorry to bring this up, but the World Cup is, of course, still going on. Germany are out thanks to a winning goal from Japan against Spain that knocked you out. And there was a pretty controversial VAR decision in the lead up to that goal that it was ruled that this ball didn't go out of play. Do you agree, just looking at this picture, that the ball didn't cross the line?
Yeah, it seems that the ball was in maybe 3-4 millimeters. But, you know, in the end, this doesn't matter because Germany should never have lost the first match against Japan. So let me only say really good luck for the English team tonight against Senegal.
Oh, there you go. You're going to be supporting England against Senegal then?
Yeah, it will be an interesting match to watch.
And just finally, I just want to show you this picture of the German team because they were certainly a team who tried to make their voices heard in Qatar, covering their mouths there to send a very clear message that they weren't allowed to, I guess, show their disagreements with some of the Qataris' positions on human rights. Were you proud of the German team for doing this? And would you have liked to see more coordinated action from European teams on this?
Yeah, let me say I was really proud of seeing them because it was a very controversial discussion about the World Cup in Qatar, as it was in the United Kingdom. And especially this very appalling interview by the head of FIFA, Mr. Infantino. So I think if there is one conclusion out of that, is that we should only have these big sporting events in countries which respect workers' rights and respect basic human rights.
That's interesting to hear you say that so firmly. I think many people would agree with that analysis as well. Thank you so much for being on the programme this morning. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, as usual, The Take will follow this programme. That's just after 9:30. It's our chance to analyse today's interviews, talk through any news lines with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. But we can get a quick take from Sam just now on things that stood out to him this morning. Good to hear from you, Sam. It's been quite a wide-ranging show, whether it's, strikes on small boats with Nadhim Zahawi, whether it's what a future Labour government would look like. I was also very interested to hear from the German ambassador about his optimism for the Brexit talks as well. What stood out to you?
Good morning, Sophie. Yes, so much to talk about after 9:30, but I want to start just with one thing right now. That's the issue that's going to cause so many headaches for people in the run-up to Christmas, and that is strikes, with a different form of industrial action facing different people every day until Christmas. What was fascinating about the way that Nadhim Zahawi engaged on the subject of strikes was that he didn't do full-blown criticism of the unions. In this big debate, which is going to affect so many people's lives, he did what Tories don't often do and adopted a relatively moderate tone towards the fact that so many people are going out on strike. For instance, he was making Vladimir Putin, not union bosses, the big enemy in this dispute. You and I, Sophie, have covered so many different bits of industrial action where it's quite clear that Tories don't like holding back when it comes to the union and love nothing more than to bash them. And I think that reflects a bigger squeamishness, a bigger uncertainty at the heart of government over how to deal with this industrial action. Could they tighten strike laws? Well, they haven't decided yet. Will they bash the union leaders in the weeks to come, or do they think that not doing so might help them get a deal over the line in certain sectors? I think that Rishi Sunak is not naturally the kind of bombast who likes to go out and publicly punch his enemies, but that makes him quite an unusual political leader in doing so.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Sam. We'll have more from Sam at 9:30 in Sophy Ridge on Sunday, The Take. Now, the recent protests in China have stunned the world. They began in response to the country's strict COVID restrictions, but eventually developed in some places to a call for an end to communist rule. And the harsh crackdown on protesters has highlighted the difficulties that many Western countries have in dealing with China. Well, joining us now is the former Conservative Party leader, Sir Iain Duncan. Thank you so much for being on the programme. I'm very keen to talk to you about China, but just first, we've just heard from the German ambassador, and I was quite interested in what he said on Brexit. He said that he was quite optimistic that there would be a change in tone on the talks on Northern Ireland, that there would be a closer relationship between the EU and the UK. What's your sort of sense of where Rishi Sunak is when it comes to Brexit?
Well, I think the truth is it's not really where Rishi Sunak is, I think, because I think he would love to have a good engagement. I think there's a big question mark for what the European Union wants to do, because in the protocol, it's quite clear that two things. One, Good Friday Agreement trumps everything else. And at the moment, we have a problem because consent doesn't take place in Northern Ireland, so which is why the unions have walked away from the Assembly. And the second thing is very important. Article 13.8 make it absolutely clear if there are any problems with the protocol can be changed in whole or in part. Right now, Mr. Šefčovič does not have the power to negotiate on 13.8, which is critical because it's not working. So what we're doing at the moment is still a slight kind of elaborate dance around this. At the heart of this is Article 13.8. I know it sounds technical, but it says the protocol can be changed in whole or in part. It's not working. We should be discussing that. And both sides reach an agreement which allows them to respect each other's market requirements. I think that's the key.
OK, interesting. Perhaps slightly further away than a previous guest.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
OK, now you are one of the most outspoken critics of China. You've previously been sanctioned by them for speaking out about the Uyghurs. So I'm interested to know your thoughts on the extraordinary scenes we've seen recently of people taking to the streets to protest. Initially, of course, about the anti-lockdown rules. About the lockdown rules. Do you think change could be happening in China?
The trouble is, I think, with all of us in the West, is that we're basically all decent people who believe in democracy, freedom, human rights, all the rest of it, whether you're in Germany or in France or in Britain or wherever or in America. Our tendency is we always want to believe that the good is coming and that somehow the natural order of things is democracy, human rights and the rule of law. But with China, I think we have to have a reality check. This is a brutal dictatorial government that thinks nothing of incarcerating people. It's carrying out genocide amongst the Uyghur in Xinjiang. I mean, literally slave labour. Products we buy have got slave labour in them here, all around the Western world, and we've done very little to stop that. So this is a government that thinks nothing of cracking down. So their control is total. They use technology in a way that we just couldn't imagine over here. All of that tells me that they're not going anywhere soon. They are determined that their form of government is right and they will not let up. So whilst they might modify around the edges because the COVID issue is causing them economic problems as well, I don't think we should overread this at all. President Xi is absolutely determined that the form of government China has is the form of government for everywhere, and he's selling it to the developing world right now.
You're very strong in your condemnation of what you see as a brutal regime. What should be the UK government response? How should we go about our relationship with China?
Well, I'm deeply disappointed in my government over this particular area because, of course, the Prime Minister said during the summer that he thought that China represented a systemic threat. And then recently he's shifted that to systemic challenge. The problem with challenge is it looks weak. We've now got a policy which sounds like it could have come from Sir Humphrey in Yes Minister, which is robust pragmatism. Now, if somebody can please tell me what robust pragmatism means, it means nothing. Robust, but also pragmatic, they cancel each other out. The reality we've got to do is we've got to change our integrated review to put China in as a systemic threat. The Americans are way ahead of us on this. Other countries in Europe are talking about it. We, the UK, could risk being left behind, dragging our feet. From that, everything flows from that about how we relate to China.
What does that mean in practical terms? I mean, I know you talked a bit about smart meters, for example, before. Are there any kind of concrete examples of what acknowledging or saying that China is a systematic threat would mean?
Being a systemic threat, then going into the integrated review as a threat, as Russia was, means that everything that the government does then flows from that point. So it means that you can no longer be ambivalent about what China does. You have to view it in the light of it being a threat. So that means, for example, we've got illegal, I think they're illegal, but the government seems to turn a blind eye to them, Chinese police stations bullying Chinese expats to go back. They're not alone in this. They're in all sorts of countries, Holland, the Netherlands, Germany, all these countries, but they're being much more aggressive about it. The Hollanders shut down theirs the other day. America's kicking them out. Yet we seem to be completely ambivalent about whether or not they're doing this bullying, having video links back to Beijing with their families brought in, being threatened in front of them if they don't go back. We've got this new embassy complex that they want to build, which is the biggest embassy complex in the whole of Europe, right in the heart of Europe, right next door to the City of London. You know, really astonishingly inept if the government now allows the appeal to go through. We can go on, all these things. Confucius Institute spying on Chinese students. Our university is completely dependent on Chinese money, and us, as an economy, far too dependent on China, a dictatorial regime. None of this can happen unless we see them as a threat. That's the key.
The pragmatism is the economic reality of it, right? That's how some would see it. At a time when, you know, it looks by all accounts like we are in a recession, do we not need to have that trade relationship with China for the good of the economy?
Well, it depends what your trade-off is. I think this is a trade-off in human lives. For me, the Uyghur being incarcerated, the women sterilised, forcibly sterilised, often raped. We've got children in re-education camps. We've got just a ton of men in forced labour camps, thousands of miles away from their family, never seeing their family again. That's just one bit of it. You've got Tibet, forced labour camps. You've got the Christian churches, the evangelical churches being cracked down on, arrests taking place. Hong Kong, you know, people being arrested for their peaceful democracy campaigns. I mean, where do you draw the line? Do we turn a blind eye to all of that and say, we just go on making money out of China? My answer is diversify. Bring some of these technologies back to Europe, to the continent of Europe, to Britain, to America. Actually start looking at India and others to invest more in, to develop them as a counterbalance. Can't go on turning a blind eye to the fact that our cheaper products come from countries that use slave labour. Not on.
I just want to talk to you a little bit, as if at the end, about the state of the Conservative Party. Polling still looking pretty difficult, to say the least. You obviously lost the Chester by-election. That itself wasn't a surprise, but Labour achieved their greatest result there for 200 years. Nadhim Zahawi said that, looking at the polls, he thinks Keir Starmer should be worried. Do you think that's right?
Well, interestingly, John Curtis, the day after, said that whilst this would give Labour this result, probably a majority, he didn't say a massive majority. His point was making that you'd have expected them to do better. I'm not now going to be clever about this, but the truth is, if you're in opposition, you should be winning a by-election like that, midterm, with all our problems right now, by a massive degree, and it wasn't as big. Now, having said that, we lost it. So the Conservatives shouldn't go around telling themselves all is OK because it's going to come right in the end.
Also, for seats like yours, I mean, your majority is, what, just over 1,000?
It's about 1,200, I think.
Yeah, you could be in trouble.
Yeah, well, I've been told I'm in trouble for the last 3 elections, but I've managed to get back. All I would say is that the Conservatives shouldn't be complacent. We have to get this economy growing. At the heart of this lies people's fears about 2 things, I think. One is obviously about migration, the boats crossing the Channel, which is headline stuff and really worrying people. The second bit, importantly, though, is growth. All the economies of Europe facing very much the same struggle, but the UK has got now the highest tax rate that it's had for a generation, and we've got to get that down. So we need growth back in the economy, easily by next spring, so that we can start to put these things right and people can feel better off with access to jobs and to good incomes. These are the key things that will win us through at the end, not tokenistic excuses about the fact it could have been better for Labour than it was.
You, of course, know what it was like to lead the Conservative Party in the depths of opposition. Do you think you might be heading back into that wilderness?
All political parties in government face the prospect of losing the next election because elections are about your record, often more than they are about the alternative. So the key question for us is to get the choice much more difficult for the public. Otherwise, we would end up going into opposition. And that means making them make a choice. And if we have growth, if we have an economy going forward, if we have people getting jobs, livelihoods looking better, people able to pay their mortgages, and we get that migration issue under control, then we're in the races and we have a chance of winning back into government. OK,
it sounds like a tough challenge.
Very tough.
Thank you very much for being on the programme and speaking so strongly about China as well. Thank you. Iain Duncan Smith there. Now, since the murder of Sarah Everard, the Metropolitan Police Service has been through a period of reflection about some officers' attitudes towards women. And now the London Fire Brigade has also come under a similar spotlight after a very critical review found it to be institutionally misogynistic and racist, with a toxic culture that allows bullying and abuse. So have lessons not been learned by major institutions? And if so, why not? Joining us now is Helen King, a former Assistant Commissioner at the Metropolitan Police Service. Thank you so much for coming to the studio this morning. It's appreciated.
Good morning.
I just want to talk about a story that broke yesterday. The head of the police watchdog resigning because the police are investigating a historical allegation about him. I mean, you really couldn't make it up.
Well, obviously, I don't know any more than is in the press already. Clearly, what needs to happen is that investigation needs to go ahead. No doubt the individual concerned is under huge pressure, and his family and so on as well. And that process has to run. But at the same time, everyone, the public, complainants, police officers need to be able to have confidence in the IOPC as well and the investigations that they carry out.
I mean, you're completely right, of course, that we don't know the details of the allegation. It would be absolutely wrong to make any judgments there. But I guess the police investigation, it seems, has been going on for some time, and yet Michael Lockwood only stepped aside when the Home Secretary told him to either quit or be suspended. It feels like there's question marks that the IOPC was even aware of the allegation.
As I say, I know no more than is in the press. It's important that the police complaint system is one that both officers and the public can have confidence in. And I think one of the constructive debates that is happening at the moment is looking at the way allegations against the police, including internal police misconduct investigations, are dealt with to make sure that police chiefs can sack police officers where that's appropriate and that those investigations can be concluded more quickly and in ways that have public and officer confidence.
Yeah, they're talking about the public confidence in the police, but also other institutions as well, because it does feel like there's been, I guess I would almost class it as like a misogyny crisis in some of these institutions. The London Fire Brigade described as institutionally misogynistic and racist. Reports of people having their helmets filled with urine, Muslim officers having pork sausages put in their pockets. And of course, the Met Police too, some of the WhatsApp messages exchanged between officers joking about rape and domestic violence. Do you think there is institutional misogyny and racism in some of these organisations?
Let's be frank, the behaviours you've described are absolutely despicable and something that both we, the public, but also the many thousands of really good, committed officers, firefighters and so on, will also find disgusting and want dealt with. But let's be frank, this isn't new. I think in a sense it's good that these conversations are being had. It's following on from the Me Too movement. Let's look at Parliament. You know, you've been a political correspondent. I suspect that, you know, there's been maybe old boys clubs and networks in a wide range of institutions.
Yeah, I think certainly Parliament is not somewhere to throw stones. I think you're probably definitely right
exactly, there. Public and private sector. But absolutely right that it's now being exposed. And of course, those who are put in positions of trust, which police officers, firefighters, emergency workers are, they do an incredible job, but we need to be able to have confidence in them. So it's right that these behaviours are exposed and dealt with. But at the same time, we need to think about how do we attract and keep really good staff, those who have the moral courage, the ethical resilience to do these really difficult jobs where they're dealing with tragedy, they're dealing with horrible situations, they're dealing often with hostility from the public, they feel they're under attack by the media, by politicians. And now we look at the state of our public services and the amount of work they're having to do, not always with the resources that they need. So I think there's a question for all of us, yes, for leaders of these institutions, but also for us to say, how do we make sure that we have the public services that we deserve and we support those who are doing these incredibly difficult jobs on our behalf?
I'm interested to know your thoughts on what can change, what can actually practically be done. The report in November, for example, found some recent examples of people who were cleared to join the police when they had past convictions for indecent exposure, assaults on women, even an arrest for rape. Do you think the vetting is up to scratch?
Vetting can always be improved, but I do think it's a blunt tool. You can generally only rely upon convictions. And of course, people with the wrong attitudes who are joining for the wrong reasons may be hiding that. So you've got to have the right training, you've got to have the right type of supervision and leadership, and a culture where people will be reported by their peers, and then a system that can push them out of the organisation. At the moment, police regulations are unwieldy. Police chiefs aren't the ones who are making the decisions about who should be sacked or not. And I think it's right that that is being opened up for question now.
Yeah, that was interesting because the new Met Police Chief, Sir Mark Rowley, in a recent interview said that, he had to employ 100 people who were only allowed to work in backroom roles. And he said, it's completely mad that I had to employ people like that as police officers who you can't trust to have contact with the public. So is there a problem about effectively not being able to sack people?
Yes, some years ago, and I understand why from a public perception point of view, the makeup of police misconduct panels was changed so that there's a legally qualified chair rather than a senior police officer who chairs those panels. I chaired dozens of those panels during my service, and my experience of sitting with lay members is that they tend to be more sympathetic towards police officers, maybe more understanding, in a way that I felt actually they shouldn't be. Police officers have to maintain the highest standards of behaviour because they're enforcing the law on with fellow citizens. So I do think that's one of a number of things that should be looked at in terms of the way police misconduct is dealt with.
You obviously worked for the Met Police. Did you witness any of this kind of behaviour, or was it things that are, I guess, more generally kept within groups of men, or did you see anything? Or?
Right. By the time I joined the Met, I was very senior. I was a police officer for 30 years in 3 different police forces. I'm not sure it's very helpful to start talking about incidents that happened 35 years ago, but I think all women who've worked in male-dominated organisations, people from LGBT communities, people from different ethnic backgrounds, when you're in a minority within an organisation, that can feel like quite a lonely place. I think the recent report about the fire service is worth a read. And it includes in that an example of what a good team looks like, where everyone feels that they're pulling together and the different strengths are seen to be making the team more stronger themselves. But I think sometimes when you're the only one and the team ethos is about a very traditional view.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, which emphasises maybe the physicality of policing or firefighting, and not recognising that actually the breadth of skills that you need to work effectively as a team means that you need different people within that team.
Yeah, I thought one of the really interesting parts of that report into the London Fire Brigade was the figures on just how white and male an organisation it is. You've said before that policing is an attractive career for sexual predators, bullies and bigots. Now, I know that you've also emphasised the really good people who work in the police, and it's important to say that. But what did you mean by that?
Well, as I said before, as a police officer, you have power over your fellow citizens. And also the way policing tends to be portrayed in the media. It's about pub fights, it's about driving cars fast. It's the more macho side, if you like, of the role. Whereas actually the figures show now about 80% of police incidents don't even involve a crime. The police more and more are picking up issues that come from people in mental health crisis, people with all sorts of vulnerabilities, missing children, missing elderly people and so on. So the way policing is seen, if you start off from a position where maybe you are a bully or a bigot, it looks like an attractive career to you. And so that's why recruitment, training, and an internal culture that does report those who really don't deserve to carry the warrant card or to wear the uniform. And there is increasing evidence of that, and reporting hotlines and so on that people can use. I went on one of those websites the other day where people give anonymous reviews of their employers. And when you look at the one for the Metropolitan Police, there are a number of people who say they're former officers complaining that you can't trust your colleagues anymore because they might report on you.
Yeah.
And I actually thought that was a very positive sign, that people are realising you can't get away with behaviour where maybe you thought you were safe in the past.
Just to pick up very quickly before we end on something you just said, 80% of police incidents don't involve a crime.
Yes.
I'm quite staggered by that. Do you think that's because you're effectively having to take on a greater role in where public services, other public services like the health service or whatever, are stretched?
It's always been true, but I suspect even more so now. Policing sometimes gets called the social services of last resort. Of all the organisations that are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the police, in effect, are the last ones left standing. And I think we would all want somebody to go and help the most vulnerable in their hour of need. But the point that Mark Rowley is making at the moment is that does become a distraction and depletes resources from those incidents that really only the police can deal with. And that's going to be a challenge for society, for those deciding where taxpayers' money goes within the public sector.
Fascinating, didn't realise that at all. Thank you so much for being on the programme today. Really interesting to talk.
Thank you, Sophie.
Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Really busy programme today, very wide-ranging. And in a moment after the break, we're going to be running through today's interviews, talking about what we learned with some analysis from myself and our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Hello, good morning. Welcome to Sophy Ridge, The Take, where we look in a bit more detail at what we've been talking about with our guests in the last hour. So it was a really busy programme, lots of different guests today, including Nadhim Zahawi, the chair of the Conservative Party. To help us go through some of the interviews and have a bit of analysis as well, we're joined, as usual, by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Hello, Sam. So one of the things that really sort of struck me about the programme today was the talk about strikes. I mean, this was the pre-brief story by the government about their contingency plans on what to do about strikes. So it's clearly what they kind of want to be talking about, partly, I guess, because of the huge disruption that people are going to be facing this winter, but partly because I just wonder if it is a more comfortable battleground for the Conservative Party at a time when they're certainly short of those. What's your take, Sam?
I think that's right. The headline that ministers want this morning is that essentially the military is going in order to help all the various, relieve all the pressure caused by the various different bits of strikes that are taking place between now and Christmas. There's some kind of industrial action every single day between now and Christmas. And the headline that they want is the army are going in. But it's really important, Sophie, to just acknowledge exactly what is and what isn't happening. There are 600 army personnel who are currently being trained to do certain tasks, starting, as Nadhim Zahawi told you, with trying to help at our borders. Now, as the Conservative Party chairman said to you, that is the thing that the government is legally bound to make sure continues to function. We can't have a non-functioning border. So I think quite a lot of these 600 will go specifically to trying to solve that problem in the event that those strikers from the PCS union don't actually end up causing some disruption. So with quite a small amount of training, I understand it's just 5 days, army personnel will be deployed to the front line. But what this won't be is a wholesale answer to the industrial action problem. Yes, they will help at borders. Maybe they will drive ambulances. But beyond that, much of the disruption that viewers this morning will experience in the last 2 weeks, well, the army won't be able to help with that, whether it's rail strikes, really whether it's nurses striking. Of course, neither the armed forces nor the other civil servants being drafted in as part of this special unit will be able to particularly help. And therefore, yes, they're trying to fight on what might be traditionally comfortable Conservative territory this morning. But if they're promising what sounds like an answer, I suspect for many people it won't feel like an answer in the weeks and months to come.
It's interesting as well because people always say that the strike's not just about pay, but clearly pay is a big part of it too. And I was quite keen to talk to Nadhim Zahawi about whether inflation matching pay rises would be reasonable. He continued the government line, which is effectively that it won't be. And he talked an awful lot about Vladimir Putin and not allowing inflation caused by him to become embedded. I did put it to him that for many people, it's about survival, not just about beating inflation. Here's his response.
The Chancellor came to the dispatch box and delivered a £150 billion energy package. By the way, if you take that into equivalence, that's the equivalent of the whole of the NHS to support people's households. Otherwise, their energy bills would have spiked, to support businesses as well. The money we're putting into helping those most vulnerable, the 8 million most vulnerable households, is significant. We have to come together. This is not a time to be divided, to, I hope, send a very clear message to Mr. Putin that he can't use energy as a weapon in this way, and we will remain united, which is why we've accepted the pay review bodies on the NHS and on schools.
A nurse on 20 grand a year, you would think that maybe there were other ways of sending Putin a clear message on Ukraine rather than the fact that you're going to have to have a real-term pay cut.
No, but we've accepted the pay review body on nurses, and as I said to you, last year they got 3%. This year's recommendation is £1,400, so the starting salary of a nurse would be £31,000. It is difficult. I am absolutely conscious of the fact of how hard things are at the moment, but this is not a time to go for 19% pay rise that will cost £10 billion, because if you accept all the inflation level pay rises, that's about £28 billion. It costs every household just short of £1,000. That is unsustainable when we're trying to be fiscally disciplined and bring inflation under control. Because if inflation is embedded, it'll hurt those families, those nurses, even more in the long term.
Nadhim Zahawi talking there. Well, let's bring Sam back in. Is there a bit of a dividing line, would you say, between the government and Labour on strikes?
Well, it's fascinating, Sophie, because there isn't really. And what was interesting about the thing we just heard from Nadhim Zahawi was, although there were implied comparisons, perhaps, between some of the union bosses and Vladimir Putin, also, really, he was casting Vladimir Putin as the enemy for pushing up inflation, for pushing up energy costs. And the tone, really, in the thing we've just seen is quite emollient, which is not a million miles away from where Labour are, because Labour, as we've been talking for anybody that's seen us chat about politics in the last few weeks, put a Labour politician, frontline politician in front of you, and they will not answer the question of whether or not there should be inflation matching pay rises. And actually this morning I thought that Bridget Phillipson went about as far, she's the Shadow Education Secretary, she went about as far as you possibly could to actually say no, Labour wouldn't be doing things particularly differently to the government, because she couldn't make promises she couldn't afford to keep. Let's hear a bit of her.
Well, I do think it means recognising the pressure that people are under right now, but also over the last 12 years, pay hasn't been keeping up with demands that workers in our vital services are facing. But you can't get to a position of agreement if you're not prepared to even have that conversation. And what I hear time and again, whether it's rail or our schools or the health service, ministers are just not prepared to sit down and talk about these issues properly. I think trust in politics matters, and I'm not going to make promises this morning to you that I don't feel confident I can deliver. I think that's been what's been so corrosive to our politics in recent years.
And it's fascinating, Sophie, because both the main political parties are effectively saying very, very similar things, but there's a calculation that underlines it, and it's actually spelt in the now. This graph is effectively simply what's going to happen with inflation. Now, this line here, that's pretty much where we are at the moment. You can see inflation, every single politician, whether you're Labour or Tory, looks like it's about to peak. But they're all really hoping that within the space of just a year, just this very short timeline here, that it's going to plunge really, really quickly. So the hope, both for the Tories and for the Labour Party, is that inflation is a problem now. Pay rises, pay disputes, an issue right now and for the next few months. But within just a year, actually, inflation is brought back under control. But as the German ambassador told you, Sophie, nobody knows whether or not the situation in Ukraine, the tensions with Russia, which is the thing that's been pushing up prices, having a knock-on effect even domestically on our politics. Nobody knows whether the talks are going to solve things and those tensions are going to go away within that very, very short time frame that the Office for Budget Responsibility says will deal with the inflation crisis. So whether you're Tory or whether you're Labour, you're placing a bet that the pain on pay is short-term. The question is all of this right?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, I thought, actually, hearing the German ambassador talk about some of those uncertainties going on, Sam. And Sam's going to show you his swingometer, I think, shortly. But before he does, I just want to talk a little bit about what Nadhim Zahawi said about some of the latest YouGov polling. Now, remember, of course, he used to run YouGov. He founded it. And now, of course, we're using his old polling company to show Labour sitting pretty comfortably ahead of the Conservative Party. Let's just listen to what he had to say to the polls.
If you actually look beneath the headline, a couple of things I would pull out from that. One, when you ask people the question, if there is an election tomorrow, how would you vote? Well, people know there's no election tomorrow. So that response, what you're seeing there, is currently how they feel about the government's track record on delivery. If you dig beneath the data, I'd be worried if I was Keir Starmer, because actually...
You'd be worried if you were Keir Starmer?
I would.
Look at that red line all the way, look at that space between the two lines.
I'm going to tell you for why, if you'll allow me, right? If you look at his numbers, it's very soft. There's not a great passion for what Keir Starmer is saying. Certainly there's no passion for him when he went before the Trade Union Congress saying he'll repeal all of the trade union legislation that the Conservatives have brought in. He's made that promise. And if you ask that same people, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think most of them will say it's a bad thing.
It's a pretty admirable optimism there by the Conservative Party chair, saying it's Keir Starmer who should be worried if he looks at that graphic. He was also, I thought, interesting how he was talking about the Conservatives will be absolutely fine at the next election if they just get to grips with the small boats and illegal migration, tackle inflation and a whole load of other things that are going to be pretty thorny issues at the least to sort out. Let's bring Sam back in, shall we? We just looked at the kind of raw polling data there, but you've been working on a tool, haven't you, along with YouGov, that shows what it would mean if there was an election. So what have you been looking at?
That's right, Sophie. And I have to say, if I was looking to buy shares in YouGov, I wouldn't particularly buy them in the event that I was listening to Nadhim Zahawi talk about the role and use of polling, because he wasn't particularly complimentary about the company that he founded. But let's have a look at where we actually are. And we're going to use this tool called a swingometer, which looks at what happens if at the next election the public go towards the decide that they want to vote for Labour in greater numbers or the Conservatives. Now, if there is no change in public support at the next election, then the swingometer would point back down there. But the Labour Party need an 8% swing in order just to get an unstable coalition and Keir Starmer to enter number 10, a 12% swing in order to get an overall majority, and to get a landslide, they need about 20% swing. That's all the way up here. But the point I want to hammer home, Sophie, is that Labour did so badly at the last election that they've got an enormous mountain to climb to do all of those things. So just for comparison, in 1997, when Blair got a landslide, it only took him a swing of 10%. Keir Starmer needs 12% just to have a majority of 1. So actually, life is much harder than it's been for any Labour leader in recent years. Now, let's go back to that Chester by-election that we were talking about on Thursday night, Friday morning, and here's the swing for him here. 13.6%. That's the swing that the Labour Party managed to achieve on Thursday night. Now, Iain Duncan, Nadhim Zahawi, perhaps suggesting that that swing could have been bigger, but it's still bigger than the swing that Labour achieved in 1997 in order to give Blair that landslide. Yes, it might only result in a 30 or so majority in the event that that was replicated in an election. But you've got to take into account that actually Labour needs to get so many seats and a big majority in order to reclimb that mountain. That means that actually all of this is pretty hard for them. So it's not a bad result given the scale of the task that they face.
It's really interesting to see it all mapped out there, and actually particularly that comparison between Tony Blair and Keir Starmer to show just what a more challenging job the current Labour leader does have. But certainly, if the things are replicated at the minute in a general election, looks like Labour on track for a majority. Sam, thanks very much for your analysis. We'll be back to you in just 1 minute, because the other clip from the programme that I was quite keen to show you was from the German ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger. Sam mentioned him a little bit earlier on. But he was quite open, I thought, on the programme, whether, it's talking about China or Ukraine, but in particular on Brexit. I was asking him if there could be a breakthrough in the deadlock over post-Brexit trade agreements, because it does feel as though there is, I guess, a bit more optimism, perhaps, from the EU side with Rishi Sunak in post. Let's have a listen.
We don't see a fundamental change in the Russian position. Putin continues this really terrorizing the civilian population, and we are very concerned about that, because these attacks on the energy infrastructure mean that many people with freezing temperatures might be forced to leave Ukraine. So we expect another wave of refugees in the coming weeks. But to your question, no, we don't see for the foreseeable future a willingness to engage in a diplomatic solution. I think that we have now a different basis for negotiations. I see an openness to engage. There have already been talks. And yes, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, because in the end, there is a landing zone for the Northern Ireland Protocol's implementation. It is possible to find a solution. The difficult issue is more the political, on the reaction of the DUP, the risk of an election in Northern Ireland. So there are many political issues which go together with it. We see also very positively that Labour is willing to have a very close relationship with Europe, and I think the rest we will have to leave it now to the negotiations, because if we achieve a solution on Northern Ireland, then this will help also to develop other areas of cooperation. So I would see the solution of the Northern Ireland Protocol question as a first step.
Well, let's bring in our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. We heard a bit about Russia there, but I just want to focus on Brexit, if I may, because it does feel like from the EU side, they think perhaps Rishi Sunak is someone they can do business with. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think Rishi Sunak likes to see himself as a deal maker. I think that's actually what lies behind the tone on the unions. And from everything that we can tell, and to be honest, Rishi Sunak hasn't said a lot publicly, I think that's his approach when it comes to Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol. He thinks that he can make breakthroughs. He thinks the alternative, we know from leaks of discussions that he had even when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, he thinks the alternative of going back to war with Europe, having a trade war that could mean tariff slaps on goods at this point where the economy is so perilous, he seems to think that that's a bad course of action, and therefore we believe he wants to strike a deal, and this appears to be what the Europeans are telling us they're finding in private discussions as well. But any kind of deal on Northern Ireland, any kind of deal on Brexit is a big, big risk for Rishi Sunak, because it's going to involve compromises. Compromises of the sort that people like Iain Duncan Smith, who you had in your studios, aren't going to like. It's probably going to involve compromises over the role of European courts and Northern Ireland. It's possibly going to involve compromises about exactly what checks take place and are overseen by the EU. So very, very thorny territory for Rishi Sunak. And so I suspect that the more positive noises you get out of Europe, the more worries there are domestically from Tory MPs.
I also asked the German ambassador about the controversial VAR decision in the Japan game. Do you think the ball went over the line, Sam?
I'm with him.
Thanks very much. Sam always warns me not to ask him about the World Cup, so obviously I can't resist squeezing something in at the end of the programme. Thanks very much. Always a good sport, Sam. Thank you for the World Cup analysis in particular. Well, that is it from Sophy Ridge on Sunday, The Take for this morning. The podcast will be following around lunchtime. That's got the best bits from our interviews, plus some analysis from me and the team as well. So do watch out for this one. It has been a busy few months, certainly, on Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Do check out our Wednesday show as well, The Take with Sophy Ridge. That's 9 p.m. Wednesdays. Always a bit of a roller coaster week for us, particularly, of course, with so much to come, whether it's strike action and, of course, the issue of small boats, which certainly feels like it's one that isn't going away for the government. Thanks very much for watching. Have a great Sunday.